Hey, are you reading the Odyssey? Because you're the only odd I see. I think I might have remembered that wrong. So, it's time for my July reading wrap-up. It's been a pretty good month in general, pretty decent, apart from just the stifling heat. I don't do well in heat waves, which is unfortunate, given the way the climate is going. But yeah, apart from that, it's been a pretty good month all round. I finished 7 books in July, of which 5 were new to me, and 2 of them were buddy reads, which was great fun. I've also read some short stories and a little bit of poetry as well. Film-wise, I watched 10 films. I've fallen very far down the horror movie rabbit hole, and for that reason, I think there are too many films to talk about in this video, so I'm going to do a separate film wrap-up video, but I will still chat a little bit about music that I listen to and other stuff like that, so I hope all of that sounds interesting to you. As for channel stuff, I just recently announced that I will be guest hosting Shaketember this year, which is a reading event all about Shakespeare, and as part of that I will be hosting a sort of spin-off poetry party, which is a Shakespeare shindig. So if you're into Shakespeare, or even sort of Shakespeare adjacent things that you could kind of work in, then I would be delighted if you would like to participate. I'll put a link in the description to my announcement video so you can find out more about it there. I would also just like to give a shout out and a huge thanks to the channel Saracen's Salute. He's been doing this series recently of celebrating booktubers, and episode 17 was dedicated to me, which was a really lovely thing. He tagged me in a tag, which I do intend to do, but in the meantime I just wanted to give a shout out to Saracen and a thanks, because he said some really nice and encouraging stuff about my channel, and yeah, it would be lovely if you go and check out his channel as well. And while I'm giving people shout outs, I just made a list of all of the people who have tagged me throughout the month of July, so I would also just like to give a quick shout out to Mark from The Book Thing, Mike from Riff Raff's Reading Renaissance, Kelly from Books I'm Not Reading, Jenny from Jenny Jables, Kevin from Kevin Toll Reads, Talia from Talia Nerds Out, Lecton from Reading from the Depths, Gareth from Books, Songs and Other Magic, Marian Dreyer from Books and Bocadillos, Alan from Big Hard Books and Classics, and Melissa from Melly in the Margins. They're all fantastic channels, and I hope you'll spend some time checking out their videos if you haven't already. But as I've got 7 books to talk about today, let's get on with it, shall we? My first read of the month was The Odyssey by Homer. This is a Greek epic from circa 650 BCE, and it was translated into English by Emily Wilson in 2017. There have been countless translations over the centuries, but that's the one I read. You probably don't need me to tell you what The Odyssey is. It's kind of in the conversation right now because of the Christopher Nolan film that's just come out. That's a pure coincidence, by the way. I'm not even really a fan of Christopher Nolan, and I have no interest in seeing the film. I just felt like reading this book, so I did. Anyway, this story follows the adventures of Odysseus, who gets quite severely delayed on his journey home from the Trojan Wars. There's also the parallel story of Odysseus' wife Penelope and their son Telemachus back home waiting for him. Penelope has a number of suitors who are impatient for her to basically give up waiting for Odysseus to return and agree to marry one of them instead. And they have come to the house and basically won't leave, and they're eating Penelope and Telemachus out of house and home. So I knew the broad strokes of the Odyssey going in. I'm familiar with at least a few of the episodes from it, the Cyclops and the Sirens and Scylla and Charybdis, all of that sort of stuff. But I'd never read the entire Odyssey. I didn't really know the structure of it, and it's quite an odd structure, really. It begins quite near the end, chronologically speaking, and a lot of the actual episodes that I'm familiar with are told in flashback, either narrated by Odysseus himself to one of his hosts as he stays with various people on his journeys, or narrated secondhand by someone who has met Odysseus and is now relating what they know about Odysseus to Telemachus, when Telemachus has left home to go and find news of Odysseus. And then much of the second half of the story is focused on Odysseus already back home and in disguise as an elderly beggar as he plans to get rid of the suitors who have beset his house. And the way he does that is quite brutal. So, as you might expect from an ancient Greek epic, some of the major themes in this include heroism and adventuring and strength in battle, all of that sort of stuff. It's also about the fickleness of the gods. They have a huge influence on what happens in this story, and whether they support or work against someone can spell disaster for someone if they're not lucky, not in favour with the gods. But another major theme of this, which I wasn't really expecting, is hospitality. It's all about, really, the correct way to behave if you're a guest in someone's home, or if you're hosting someone in their home. The way that Odysseus and Telemachus behave to their hosts is kind of indicative of the right way to do it, whereas the suitors, in contrast, are terrible guests, and for that they must die. I found this an interesting reading experience, although personally for me not an amazing one. I did like Emily Wilson's translation. It's in fairly plain modern English. She deliberately didn't want to make it sound archaic and fancy, because that wouldn't really reflect what Homer's audience would have heard, and putting in a bunch of these and thous wouldn't make it any more authentic a translation than doing it in today's English. So I like that, and it's also presented in iambic pentameter, which I'm very at home with thanks to Shakespeare. That's also very helpful for just working out what syllable people's names are supposed to be emphasized on, like Telemachus and not Telemachus. So yeah, it's a decent translation, but I think I'm just not crazy about the source material. It's quite repetitive in a lot of ways. I mean, every time Odysseus or Telemachus visits someone, there's kind of this dance of hospitality, and everyone has to fulfill their roles, and it all just gets a bit repetitive. There's also a lot of stock phrases that appear just repeatedly throughout. Like, whenever the sun rises, there's reference to rosy-fingered dawn, lucky dawn. But no matter how many different ways Emily Wilson finds to rephrase rosy-fingered dawn, it's still the same basic image that just crops up again and again. And that's kind of normal for an epic poem that's told in the oral tradition. So yeah, I think it's just something that it's inherent in the style and the genre, and I found it personally a bit annoying after a while. So yeah, I can't say I really loved it, but I'm definitely glad I read it. It's one of those big gaps in my literary knowledge that I've been wanting to fill for a while, and I'm really glad now that I've done it. It's such an influential piece of work that continues to be in the literary conversation, as it were. I mean, they're still making movies of it now, so definitely something that was worth me reading, just for my own kind of self-education. So, did I love it? No, not really. Did I have a good time kind of educating myself by reading it? Yes, I feel I feel slightly more knowledgeable now in terms of world culture and history. So yeah, in that sense, it's a positive experience. So what's next in my quest to plug up the gaps in my literary knowledge? Well, the Odyssey is kind of a sequel to the Iliad, so I probably should have read the Iliad first, but I didn't. Will I read it next? Probably not right away. I will eventually get to it, but I think next might be, and I don't know when exactly, but I do want to read the Aeneid by Virgil. Now that's partly because Ursula K. Le Guin, one of my all-time favourite writers, wrote a novel called Lavinia, which is a retelling of the Aeneid from Lavinia's perspective. So I definitely want to read that. Therefore, I think it would help to read the Aeneid first. But when am I going to get around to that? I don't know. My next read of the month was Fictions by Jorge Luis Borges. This is a collection of surreal, postmodern, metafictional short stories, originally written between the late 30s and early 40s and collected in 1944. This edition was translated from the Spanish by Andrew Hurley. I had heard Borges' name mentioned quite a lot over the years, and I'd never really checked out his stuff before. And now that I have, I absolutely see the hype. When I first started reading this book, I was a little bit worried that it might be a little bit above me, a little bit beyond me. Some of the cultural and literary references in that first story were just so outside my sphere that I kept having to check the notes and Google things, and I was a bit worried that reading the whole book might take me ages if it was all going to be like that. But once it settled down, the rest of the stories were actually much more approachable, and I ended up having just a fantastic time reading these stories. It might be one of the best short story collections I've ever read. There are maybe a couple in there that I maybe just lack some of the cultural references for. Like there's one that's a sort of a twist on a story that is apparently famous in Argentina, but I'm not familiar with it at all, so I didn't quite get that one, I have to say. But for the most part, I fully embraced the glorious strangeness that is Borges. These are really creative, very smart but very playful stories that mess around with structure and metafiction and reality and unreality and all of this sort of stuff in a way that I found really engaging and really fun. There's stories that are presented as book reviews for books that don't actually exist, which in the foreword Borges says was kind of his labor-saving way of writing the story without actually having to write the whole book. There's also things like circular narratives and like unreal liminal spaces. There's like an infinite library that's the whole world and contains every possible book, like every combination possible of letters in any number of pages. So, every book that is worth reading is in there, but also a whole lot of nonsense. There's the stories that play with the conventions of like detective fiction and other kind of literary genres and archetypes. And I just had such a great time with this that I'm kind of rambling and running away with myself now. All that is to say, I'm definitely fully on board with Borges immediately, and I definitely want to read more of his stuff. Next up, we have Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut. This is a satirical, apocalyptic sci-fi novel from 1963. This was a reread for me, but one that I hadn't revisited since about 2007, and it was also a buddy read. I read this with Lecton from Reading from the Depths. Cat's Cradle is narrated by an unnamed narrator. He's a journalist, and we learn that he had been working on a book about the people who designed the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima, and his focus was what all of the people who were involved in the bombing actually did on the day. However, circumstances lead him to write a completely different book, the book that we're reading. Our narrator is a recent convert to a religion called Bokononism. This is a religion founded on the cheerful admission that it is all lies, but that sometimes lies can actually be beneficial. For a more deadly serious take on that idea, you could also read The Wild Duck by Henrik Ibsen. Bokononism has various kind of jargon terms. For example, FOMA means harmless untruths, and the book begins with live by the FOMA that make you brave and kind and healthy and happy. This contrasts very strongly with the way that Vonnegut portrays science in the book. Science is, a search for truth, but if it can be used so irresponsibly as to create weapons of mass destruction that could lead to the end of the world, then, maybe we should take the lies instead. So this social commentary and social satire is woven into a story that is full of coincidences that are maybe not as coincidental as all that. There's another quote in the book that peculiar travel suggestions are dancing lessons from God. It's hard to really summarize the plot. It's really the themes that are the most engaging thing in this book. It's also an enjoyable plot in itself, but it's definitely a plot kind of predicated on coincidence and really serving the themes and the social commentary and satire that Vonnegut is trying to get across. It was an absolutely fantastic read. I remembered loving it when I first read it, like nearly 2 decades ago, but reading it again now, I think I might have even liked it more than I used to. I also had a great time buddy reading it with Lecton. It's such a thought-provoking and interesting book that really fueled some deep and fascinating discussions, and I got a lot out of it, and I think so did Lecton. I certainly had an amazing time with this book and with Lecton. So all in all, that was a definite highlight of not just the month, but the year. Next up, we have 1,000 Cranes by Yasunari Kawabata, translated into English by Edward G. Seidensticker. This is a Japanese novel, originally serialized between 1949 and 51, and then published as a full novel in 52. Thousand Cranes is narrated by a man called Kikuji. His late father was a serial philanderer, and at the start of the story, Kikuji receives an invitation to a tea ceremony run by one of his father's mistresses, or former mistresses, Chikako. And she has this kind of ulterior motive to introduce Kikuji to a young woman that she hopes to arrange a marriage with. However, things don't quite go to plan, because also at the tea ceremony is another of Kikuji's father's exes, a woman called Mrs. Ota. And he was actually much happier with Mrs. Ota than he ever was with Chikako. He had only a short-lived affair with Chikako, which left her somewhat bitter and resentful, whereas he had quite a long and happy affair with Mrs. Ota. Obviously, that wasn't really happy for his wife or for Mrs. Ota's husband, but yeah, Mrs. Ota has much fonder memories of Kikuji's father, and when she meets Kikuji, she's reminded of his father, and, well, one thing leads to another, and they start to have an affair too. However, when Mrs. Ota discovers that she may have interfered with a potential marriage arrangement, she is racked with guilt. Her daughter, also, Fumiko, she pleads with her mother not to see Kikuji again. However, they do come together again, and things get much more complicated from there. This is a story with a complex web of emotions. It's all about generational guilt and the way that people remind each other of fathers and sons and daughters, and how that kind of complicates their relationships with each other. There's also a lot of imagery surrounding teaware, ceramics and things, especially things that are family heirlooms, and how these objects come to almost represent the people who are missing from Kikuji's life. I really enjoyed reading this. It was a really interesting experience. I found the writing really delicate and evocative. However, once I got to the end of it, I wasn't really sure what my takeaway was. It ends on a kind of ambiguous note. Like, you think something might have happened, but you don't get confirmation either way whether that thing has indeed happened. So I was left kind of unsure how to really interpret the story. It probably also doesn't help that I probably lack some of the cultural context that would enrich my understanding. I mean, I've watched plenty of Japanese films from this sort of era, but yeah, I don't have the kind of insider knowledge that would help me kind of understand this story more fully. So while I did enjoy the process of reading it, and I thought it was beautifully written, I can't say that I fully loved it, even though I was fairly on board with it. So I'm definitely glad I read it, but yeah, it's not really a favourite. Next up, we have Fair Play by Tove Jansson. This was originally published in 1989, and I read the English translation by Thomas Teal. Before I go on, I'd like to thank Nick from Dr. Cranky Pants Reads for mentioning this book on his channel, because I was already a fan of Tove Jansson, but I didn't really know where to start with her non-Moomins books. So when I saw Nick's discussion of this book, I added it to my wish list immediately, and yeah, I finally got around to reading it months and months later, and I'm really glad I did, because, well, as you'll see, it's really lovely. Fair Play is a very quiet and gentle novel really a sort of series of short vignettes, if anything. It follows the lives of two older women, Yona and Mari, who are lovers. And they are also both artists in one way or another. Mari is an author and Yona is an artist, a visual artist. And given that Tove Jansson and her lifelong partner were also a writer and an artist, it's not easy to deduce that these characters are heavily inspired by the real life of Tove Jansson and her partner. The short chapters, these vignettes, slowly build up an image of a life together and a relationship. It's, I think, quite an unsentimental, an unfluffy depiction of romance. It's deeply loving, but also quite pragmatic and practical. It's about not just the time that they spend together, but the space that each of them requires to do their work. They spend a lot of time apart. They live in separate apartments nearby. So they're not kind of in each other's pockets, but they do spend a lot of time together. And obviously the love they have for each other is deep and genuine and abiding for decades. I was already a fan of Tove Jansson through her Moomins books, and this was the first time that I'd read one of her books for adults. And although it's a different thing from Moomins, in a lot of ways it gave me quite a few of the same thoughts and feelings. I think that Tove Jansson was quietly radical. This isn't a kind of preachy book that is demanding your attention and your respect. It's simply a quiet demonstration of another way of living. And that's something that I get from Moomins as well. I think that this is a really beautiful book. At first, I thought that the vignettes felt a little bit kind of inconsequential, perhaps a little bit mundane, but taken all together, it does build this picture that I think is really convincing and really beautiful. I did read this at bedtime as an ebook, so I read it slower than I would read my daytime books, and I think that was beneficial for it. I think this is a book that demands to be savoured and taken in slowly. I mean, it's a very short book, so you could just power through it in an afternoon or two if you really wanted to. But I think it benefits from taking it at a slower, more relaxed pace and kind of letting Yona and Mari kind of just sink into your life a little bit. Spend some gentle and slow, thoughtful time with them. And I think, like me, you might come to love them too. Next up, we have Going Postal by Terry Pratchett. This is another shiny Pratchett book. It's the 33rd Discworld book, published originally in 2004, and it's the first in a new sub-series or strand of the Discworld, starring the semi-reformed conman Moist von Lipwig. Going Postal begins with the amazingly named Moist von Lipwig on death row. He is hanged not quite to death, and then given a reprieve by Lord Veterinari, the somewhat benevolent tyrant who rules the city-state of Ankh-Morpork. Moist is given a choice. He can either walk out the door and never hear from Lord Veterinari again, or he can agree to take over the ailing post office. However, when he sees what's on the other side of the door, there's not really that much of a choice. At first, Moist is desperate to escape. However, he's been assigned a parole officer, a golem, who is tireless and basically inescapable. And he eventually kind of settles down to actually make a serious effort to run the post office, to revive it, because it is in a hell of a state. It's in complete ruins and full of undelivered mail, like decades of undelivered mail. And Moist von Litvig starts to come up with ideas that can revive the post office. He hires more golems as postmen. He invents postage stamps, and he does various publicity stunts that basically take the chutzpah of a con man, but puts it to a more positive use. All of this puts the post office in direct competition with the Clacks. The Clacks is a network of semaphore towers which operates as essentially Discworld's equivalent of email. The Clacks is owned by a company called the Grand Trunk, which is run by Reacher Gilt, possibly the only con man greater than Moist von Litvig, and only Moist can see that, or at least only Moist and probably Veterinari. Moist also comes into contact with Adora Belle Deerheart. She's a beautiful, very cynical, chain-smoking golems' rights activist, and she runs a sort of employment agency for golems. That's where Moist hires the extra golem postmen. And the two of them develop this sort of this flirtation and this burgeoning relationship. And Moist realizes that it's probably the first time that he's really flirted as himself. The first time he's been attracted to someone just because he's attracted to them and not for what he can get out of them as part of a con. So it's all kind of new territory for him. And as the plot develops, he realizes that something in his past might kind of jeopardize that relationship. So, like with most Terry Pratchett books, there's a lot of plot threads here, and the way that he weaves them together is so satisfying. It's a really fun and engaging read with some great new characters and some welcome appearances from some more familiar faces. I had read this once before, and I remembered being really impressed and really loving it, and it was great to reread it again because I loved it all over again. It's also just gloriously nerdy. I mean, the stuff here about the invention of postage stamps and stamp collecting, and also like web hacking, basically, and the operation of telecommunications. But, you don't need to be a nerd about those things to enjoy the story on its own. It's just kind of extra nerdy flavour, I guess. I really enjoy Moist von Litvig as a character. I find him really interesting. It's about his reinvention and his learning to kind of do the right thing, but also to use some of his kind of less honest skills for good, for a change. So I really enjoy that. I enjoy his dynamic with Adora Belle Deerheart. And yeah, all the supporting characters are great as well. It's just it's a really good time. In fact, it's one of my favourite Discworld books. And I do think that if you're looking for a way in to Discworld and you want to read something where Pratchett is really at the top of his game, then even though this is book 33 of Discworld, if you don't mind that, then this could actually be a really good entry point to Discworld. It's introducing a new character, and although it probably does enhance things a bit to already know who Lord Veterinari is, you kind of, I think you can figure it out as you go and follow the story of Moist von Litvig. And yeah, I would highly recommend, if you want to give Pratchett a go, going Postal is, I think, an excellent place to start. And my last read of the month, or at least my last novel, was We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. This is a classic Russian sci-fi dystopia from 1924, and I read the English translation by Clarence Brown. We is set in a far future where the majority of the population has been wiped out in a vicious 200-year war, and the survivors now live in small pockets, kind of walled in by glass and ruled by a totalitarian government called One State. The book is narrated by an engineer called D503. All of the characters have just numbers and letters as their names. So all the men have names that start with consonants and all the women with vowels. So D503 is an engineer, the lead engineer of this project to create a spaceship called the Integral. The plan is for the Integral to go into orbit and disseminate basically One State propaganda to the rest of the galaxy. And part of that propaganda is the very book that we are reading, narrated by D. It's basically presented as D's diary, and at first he is very much a happy and willing participant in One State's totalitarian government. They run everything on a very strict schedule. Everybody has like 2 free hours in the day. Their work day and even their sleep is scheduled, and there's no families or monogamous relationships by choice. People basically apply to be paired with someone, and then they receive pink slips with permission to, get together. And because everyone lives in glass houses that are completely see-through, basically the only time that people are allowed to drop the blinds is during pink slip time. However, things start to change for D503 when he meets I330, and she's a very beautiful and talented and seductive woman who he is immensely attracted to, and she introduces him to an underground resistance movement. At first, Dee wants to report them and denounce them, but because he's so infatuated with I330, he can't do it. And she basically uses that to the advantage of the resistance movement. They have plans that involve Dee, and he has really conflicted feelings about all of this. As the story goes on, he starts to develop self-reflection and an imagination. He starts having dreams, which in this society are considered an illness and not just like normal human thing, which, is really disturbing. But Dee really struggles with this, and you can see in his writing the conflict between the indoctrinated One State version of himself and this new version that is kind of drawn towards the revolution and sort of in revolution with himself as well. And that was one of my favourite themes of the novel. One State is predicated on the fact that they are the winners of the final revolution. And this is a book about Dee coming to realise or accept that there can be no final revolution. I330 asks him as a mathematician, what is the highest number? And he rightly says, there is no highest number. And by the same token, there is no final revolution. And you can take that both literally as in political revolutions, but also self-revolution. There is no final state of the self. And, as someone who is constantly reflecting and changing and sometimes feeling a bit confused by my changing self, I found that a really interesting and oddly comforting theme. Although I will say this really isn't a comforting book. It's a very powerful book, but definitely not comforting. It is hugely influential, though, and I can absolutely see why. It was a massive influence on George Orwell for 1984, and I think also Aldous Huxley for Brave New World. I must confess I haven't read 1984, although thanks to cultural osmosis, I am pretty aware of what it's about. And I have read Brave New World, and I can absolutely see how this book was an influence on both of them. So this is a very powerful book, and I think made more powerful by a little bit of background knowledge on Zamyatin's life. He wrote this in 1920s Soviet Russia. He had previously been involved in the revolution, but once the communist government took charge, he found that he wasn't really much happier under that regime either. And basically, either way, he was something of an outsider. He really valued freedom. And, this is a book all about freedom and personal expression and individuality. The book actually had to be smuggled out of the country, and the first time it was published was actually an English translation. It was then smuggled back into Russia, and when it was eventually published, it was heavily suppressed by the government, and he applied to leave the country, which luckily they allowed, but he did basically live the rest of his life in poverty and exile. So he wrote this book at great personal cost to himself, and given the themes of the book, he didn't just talk the talk, he really walked the walk. It's quite a sad story, both the story of Zamyatin and also the story of We, but it's very powerful, and I have an immense respect for him to dare to publish this. That said, I did find the plot a little bit baggy in places, and because Dee is quite an unreliable narrator, there were parts of it that I found a little bit unclear, a little bit confusing. I buddy read this with Lecton from Reading from the Depths, and I think he found the same thing. There were a few points that we just weren't really clear on, and I don't think that was a translation issue, because we were actually reading different translations and both had pretty much the same questions that we were struggling with. But it was a fantastic buddy reading experience anyway. We had some really interesting and thought-provoking discussions. I mean, reading with Lecton, I always have those kinds of discussions, but this book was great at inspiring and prompting those discussions. So, yeah, it was a great read and a great buddy read. So, probably not a favourite book of the year, but one that I have an enormous respect for. So, those are all the novels that I finished in July. I did also read a handful of short stories, all of them by Ursula K. Le Guin, and all of them collected in Volume 1 of the complete Hainish novels and stories. Those 4 short stories were Winter's King, Vaster Than Empires and More Slow, The Day Before the Revolution, and Coming of Age in Carhide. The first 3 of those were actually rereads for me. They were all featured in The Wind's 12 Quarters, which I read back in December and had a great time with them. Winter's King especially improved quite a lot for me on rereading it this time. It's set on the same planet as The Left Hand of Darkness, and having reread The Left Hand of Darkness since first reading Winter's King, I appreciated that story a lot more this time round. Vaster Than Empires and More Slow was one of my favourites when I first read it, and it was great to revisit. It's not quite a horror story, but it's certainly horror adjacent. It's quite creepy and unsettling. It's about a team of explorers who visit a very far distant planet which they expect to be completely uninhabited. The team includes an empath who can sense emotions, and on this seemingly uninhabited planet, he can sense an unsettling amount of fear. The Day Before the Revolution was also great to revisit. It's a prequel to The Dispossessed, and when I first read it, I hadn't read The Dispossessed, so it was great revisiting it now when I have quite recently read The Dispossessed in the Le Guin reading group hosted by Gareth from Books, Songs and Other Magic. I think that is an absolutely beautiful story, and it's made even stronger by now being familiar with The Dispossessed. And the last of those stories, the only one that I wasn't previously familiar with, is Coming of Age in Carhide, which is also tied in with The Left Hand of Darkness. And if you're familiar with The Left Hand of Darkness, then you'll know that the inhabitants of Carhide, which is on the planet of Winter, or Gethin, are all kind of gender neutral, and when they enter their sort of mating phase, then their gender could go kind of either way, depending on the circumstances. And so Coming of Age in Carhide is an account of what puberty is like, what it's like to first experience that. It's a really interesting story, and also interesting that Le Guin revisited that planet so much later, because Left Hand of Darkness was written in the late 60s, and this was written in the mid-90s. But speaking of Gareth's Le Guin reading group, I just recently took part in a live stream discussion of The Word for World is Forest. That was great to catch up with the group and discuss a really fascinating and powerful book. And we're planning a discussion on The Dispossessed very soon as well, so stay tuned to Gareth's channel for that. I did also have one DNF this month. It's only my second DNF this year, and the first since I think about February or March, so in general I'm having a really good reading year. Unfortunately, I didn't get on very well with Three Bags Full by Leonie Swan. This is the book that the recent film Sheep Detectives is based on. So it's a murder mystery where a flock of sheep try to solve the mystery of who murdered their shepherd. That sounds like it should be really fun, and I was all in on the idea of it. I was expecting a really fun, quick and breezy read. And although it started out fun, it just dragged on interminably, because it's about twice as long as it needs to be. It's just under 400 pages. That's far too long for a novel about crime-solving sheep. That's ridiculous. And I guess it didn't help that I was reading it as a bedtime ebook, so I was reading it in quite small chunks. So it took even longer than it would have done if I had been reading it in the mornings when I read for longer, and probably read a bit faster because I'm not sleepy. But yeah, I suppose I should have predicted that a novel about sheep would send me to sleep. But yeah, just the pacing was frustratingly slow, and it's just far too long for, as I say, a novel about crime-solving sheep. So yeah, unfortunately, I got about halfway through and just completely lost my patience, decided to DNF it, and yeah, I'm still struggling to decide what my next bedtime ebook will be. Hopefully, I'll get back to something soon. According to my notebook, I listened to 57 albums in July, of which 7 were new to me. My most listened to artists were Kate Bush and Fred Frith, with 4 each, Field Music, Shudder to Think, Sonic Youth, with 3 each, and Cardiacs, Deerhoof, Hammered Hulls, PJ Harvey, Massacre, McCluskey, Melvins, MSSV, and Bill Orcutt, with 2 each. My listening highlight of the month was definitely the album Speechless by Fred Frith. I wrote a blog post just recently. On a side note, I haven't been blogging very much recently. I found that I haven't had the energy to do both videos and write blog posts. So I've been focusing on videos. But as I say, I did write a blog post recently about kind of going back to listening to music the way I listened to it as a teenager, when I had less music to hand. You know, I didn't have streaming, I didn't have as big a music collection, and therefore I used to listen to the same albums repeatedly, and they would have more of a chance to grow on me and become music that ultimately I really deeply love. And I think when I have more music to choose from, I sometimes kind of skim over albums. If they don't kind of hit right away, I might not give them enough of a chance to really grow on me. So I decided to make a kind of a concerted effort to give certain albums more of a chance to grow on me, and Speechless by Fred Frith is one of those albums. When I first heard it, I remember thinking to myself, this is probably amazing once you know it well enough. And sure enough, it's amazing once you know it well enough. The other album I gave a similar treatment to was The Dreaming by Kate Bush, which again, I remember thinking, this is probably really good once you know it well enough. And yeah, the more I listen to it, the more it grows on me. I think I still want to give it some more listens, but it's certainly getting there. The bit at the end. So that's everything I read in the month of July, and also a bit about what I listened to. As I mentioned earlier, I watched so many films in July that I've decided to separate that out into its own movie wrap-up video. So keep an eye out for that if that's the sort of thing you might be interested in. Anyway, I'd love to hear in the comments if you've read any of the books that I talked about in this video and what you thought of them, or if any of them sound interesting to you and you think you might give them a go. Or, you know, whatever else is on your mind. I'm always happy to hear from you. Anyway, that's about it from me today. I hope you're having a lovely day, and I will see you when I see you.